We continue in our stewardship series today. Get this on. And stewards of God, people, programs, and why we do what we do. Our initial image was that cracked pot, because we're all cracked pots, right? But this is actually an art form where they fill the cracks with gold powder, so that what was the most broken part becomes the most valuable part. And I think that's what it means to be a steward of God, is he uses our brokenness and turns it into something very beautiful and redemptive. So that's all of us. You know, it's grace, Bible, cracked pots. Okay. So just remember that. That's us. So, but as kind of an overview of it, stewardship in the self, stewardship in fear, which is today and probably beyond today. Stewardship, God's holiness and God's presence, stewardship in leading people, stewardship in financial giving, stewardship in missions, stewardship in the Universal Church, stewardship in Grace Bible Church, and stewardship in passing the baton. As we get down here, and you take a step back at what's really going on in the world, are what we think of as evangelical Christianity, which is very reformed, very European. We are annihilating ourselves through really a negative birth rate, through less and less children, abortion, things like that. And there's a radical shift going on in the world as to what is probably going to be the heart and soul of Christianity 25 years from now, 30 years from now. So that's what our secular enlightened society has done for us. But that's down the road, just the different things we can touch on. But this one is huge. Because as soon as our self went astray, our soul went astray in Eden with massive fear. And it affects so much of what we do. And we have been living with it for so long, from pre-verbal states, as we're born into the world, that we've acclimated to it in a lot of ways. And we have all these coping mechanisms and ways of dealing with it. And God is hitting this stuff all the time in the Word. So many times he's putting people in places where they're terrified. And he's trying to undo some things that are very, very deeply embedded in us. We have massive problems with fear. And that's what we want to focus on today, because we're not going to do, since we are fallen and we're cracked pots, if we don't do a better job of knowing our own fear and facing it, we're not going to do any of this. It's going to come out in all kinds of ways. We're not going to do any of this the way we could. Fear. Last week, stewardship in the self, implement the basics, cooperate with God's goal. You were put on earth to achieve your greatest self, to live out your purpose, and to do it courageously, fearlessly. Know yourself, spirit, soul, and body, and ask the right questions. Our big picture was, we're in a crashing plane, right? We have fallen. The plane's damaged. First thing you got to do is secure your own breath, your own spirit, your own oxygen mask. And when you are breathing well and your spirit's in a good place, that's when you can be the best help to other people. For that to happen, you got to ask the right questions. We'll be coming back to these a lot. So I'm not going to spend much time on them today, but these are an application of what God said to Adam and Eve and what God said to Cain. You know, just in the very beginning, the kinds of questions that God asked. Because fear drives us to ask a lot of things. I'll come back to that in a minute. But God, when mankind fell and showed fear and shrank back from God, God started asking questions. And very closely related to fear, Cain feared rejection. That really upset him. He got angry. A lot of our anger is rooted in an unhealthy fear, is unhealthy and is rooted in fear or a sense of threat. And we get tired of feeling threatened and we push back. But do we really understand what the real threat is? In all of this, the real threat is that sin will rule over you, that you'll miss what God has for you. And that's what happened to Cain. Sin is crouching at the door, but you may rule over it. Cain couldn't do that by himself, but God would have helped him. Cain, of course, didn't handle it well. We move on to stewardship and fear. Stewardship and fear. In a sermon, or two or three, about facing fear, what would you like to see discussed? This is my time to take notes from you. What would you like to see discussed? Because today is really just the first sermon and kind of introducing us to it and hoping that we can actually just be honest and really begin engaging our fear. We're going to land in 1 Peter 5 today, but in a sermon about fear, what would you like to see discussed? I'm not going to discuss it today. I'm not going to wing it, but this isn't Faith Facts tonight, and I'll wing it. But Joe. Okay. Okay. And you'll speak on that point. Fear in the family. Andy. Any sense of threat leading to anxiety, stress, there's a spike that goes on you. Surrender? Fear of surrender? Surrendering to fear. Help me out a little bit more. Okay. Giving in the sense of accepting it, or giving in and letting it rule you? All right. We'll actually touch on that some today. I've said several times in the last few weeks, all those t-shirts that people wear saying no fear, they're all lies. Okay, perfect love casts out fear. All right, and since there's like one human who did that, and even he had to process through, in a sense, fear, and he did, and he cast it out. For the rest of us, it's a lie. It's not no fear as an N-O, it's no fear, K-N-O-W. And when you do, and you handle it the right way, it can be very empowering. So, and we'll touch on that some today, so that's really good. Jeremy? Fear of rejection. Joe? And you'll help me out on that one? Yes. Some of that will go back to fear in the family. Yes. And some of that we'll touch on today as well. It's amazing how fear impacts us. Okay. Dee and Vicky and Robin, maybe and Phil. Okay, so Dee, Vicky, Robin, Phil. Then we'll move on, or we'll be preaching on fear until I die. Dee, Vicky, Robin, Phil. Did I get that? Dee.
Why fear, not only from a spiritual standpoint, but from a psychological, emotional standpoint?
Okay. So spirit, soul, and body.
Yep, all those.
Okay. Was Dee, Vicky, Robin, Phil. Okay. Vicky.
Fear of falling short.
Fear of falling short. You're talking like emotionally, right? Not physically? That's what they were laughing about. I didn't think of it. They thought of it. I just ran with it. Yes. Fear of falling short. Fear of failure. Fear of failure is huge. Okay. Well, wait. Oh, Tanya's just slip one in? No, that's you're Okay. Wait. I'll tack you on. All right. Robin. Mm-hmm.
And it's trying not to fear those bad things that could possibly happen, even though it's feeling like
Yeah.
I know I got hands, and I know it's all going to be good, but that doesn't mean it's good.
Now, we often quote Romans 8:28, I think misunderstanding it. We know that in all things God is working for good. He's not saying everything is good. Okay. Well, this idea of trusting God in a world where bad things happen and not having to somehow pretend that somehow that's good. And how do you balance that where we need to trust God because you feel like his character is trustworthy, but that doesn't mean you're not going to get trucked. Okay, and so how do you work that out? All right, so we had Phil and Tanya.
Well, there's a country song entitled
Mm-hmm.
And I think fear of physical death is a big one for a lot of people.
Yeah. The last enemy to be overcome, really. Fear of physical death. Everybody wants to go to heaven. Nobody wants to die. And Tanya.
So, the way that how fear can kind of be disguised as something else, like
Sure.
righteousness or fear, especially in the terms of
Fear, in some ways. Vesta. If I don't acknowledge her, it'll be going on the whole service. No. Tanya, I'll let you speak, Vesta. Tanya was saying just how fear wears masks. And that's part of what we'll look at today. There's times where we admit, oh, wow, that scared me. But remember, from pre-verbal times, I'll unpack this some today. We have felt fear, and it is, in the ultimate sense, generational. It's archetypical to the human race, going back to Adam and Eve. It's collective. In so many ways that we are experiencing fear, but we don't acknowledge it as fear. It wears a mask, and it often wears a mask where we have to be right, or we have to be in power, or we have to be in control. And then our logic kicks in of all the reasons why that's the case. And actually, they might be good reasons, they might be bad reasons, but it isn't really what's driving you. It's fear. And whatever your reasons, what we think good or bad, if you're not dealing with the fear, it turns bad very quickly. Okay, so, Vesta. I don't know what you're talking about. Certainly we don't have that at all here at Grace Bible Church. Fear of faulty government or authority. Yeah, that's part of the control thing. So there's so many ways that fear plays out. And really my goal for today is to kind of dig a little deeper as to how fear impacts us and land with some things with Peter. Now, did Peter struggle with fear? Did Peter show a high level of awareness that he struggled with fear? No. We're Peter. We're Peter. Fear is so powerful and so pervasive. Stewardship and fear. Anxieties, askings, not technically an English word, but I insisted on using it. So, anxieties, askings, and Jesus in the storm. Okay, stewardship and fear. Everything you ever wanted is on the other side of fear. The greatest fear we have is the fear of death. And death wears many faces. It's not just physical death. There are people, and I think the Apostle Paul is one of them, who to a very high degree overcame all physical beings' fear of death and being taken out of what we can observe and know and having to trust. Death totally strips away our control. But that fear of death, though I think Paul wrestled through, and Paul also had direct experiences that helped him face a fear of death that we don't have, and he was held accountable to be faithful to live according to those experiences he had. As Jesus said about all the apostles, well, you believe because you've seen. Yeah, you shouldn't fear physical death as much. You have eyewitness evidence that there's a hope beyond the grave. And we haven't seen that. So they were expected, and they all did, to face those kinds of things with more courage, more tenacity, have fear control them less. But in the end, death is probably best defined as separation. And all of us in different ways have separation anxieties. And what that does to us. Fear is one of the hardest things to deal with. It wears many faces, and I call these faces faces of death. But it doesn't have to rule over us. It doesn't have to be this way. And that's what we want to explore in our stewardship together, because we will not be as faithful as God is calling us to be if we don't pull this fear out of ourselves. Not no fear, but pull it out, look at it, no fear, and say, okay, and so how is that playing out in my life? And how do I need to deal with that? So once we lost ourselves in Eden, fear came in. But like so many of what we experience primarily as negative emotions, for lack of a better term, fear is not actually innately bad. There is one fear that's called good. We hear that God is a jealous God, and we think of ourselves as jealous, and then we think that God's petty and possessive, and he's not. But we see God getting angry, and we think of how we are when we get angry, and think God's like that. He's not. And though fear is a little bit different, God in human form, Jesus, says that Isaiah prophesied about him, that Christ delighted in the fear of the Lord. It was positive to him. And that's not the kind of fear that John's talking about when he says perfect love casts out fear. But it's just one of these things where, as a human being or as any creature, in a way, fear becomes your focus, even if you don't realize it is. It takes over your whole being, not just spiritually, not just psychologically, bodily. And it becomes your focus. And it wears masks. So there's these kinds of things of what I feel like I must accomplish, and the last thing I expect happen to me, and that I could ever accept happening to me. You know, an extremely brutal thing to think about happening to you, and you know, I've talked with Steve Henry multiple times yesterday and today, is to think about burying my own child. I have buried an infant daughter, but to bury a child, I mean, if I think of, I've got, 4 of my kids here today, and my 5th one isn't here, but thinking of an adult child that I live with and putting them in the ground first. I want to avoid that. Okay, and that's a fear. But we don't always necessarily think of these things that are really driving us as fears. We've had the mask. We've been dealing with it for so long. We can even say, well, I want to fulfill my potential, which we should as stewards. I put that up there, to be your best self. But if what's really driving you to be your best self is fear of failure, you don't really understand grace. There's no condemnation. If you know Christ, in the end, there's no failure. Because the only failure that God's like saying, no, that's a failure, that's a problem, is hell. He can fix everything else. So I found myself saying this to several people recently, very much struggling with discouragement. I say, do you understand that an eternal life cannot be squandered? Because you've always still got all eternity. That doesn't mean there's not accountability, that there isn't, wood, hay, stubble, and burning that off. I'm just saying, but this thing that creeps, I've wasted my life. You have all eternity in front of you. But there is a positive form of fear that can be empowering. It's kind of what I think Andy was touching on. It causes us to worship and to act from a positive place. This is the fear that the seraphs have in Isaiah. This is the fear that Christ delighted in. How do we get somewhere closer to that place? No fear is a lie, as in no fear. But to get closer to that place, we do have to know fear, and we have to get a better sense of knowing how it's impacted us as people, how it's played out in my life, in my family, in my story of origin, in my narrative. Because it's become absolutely epidemic. Our society is terrified, and what you're getting as people deal more and more with fear but don't want to admit it is extreme self-righteousness on both sides of the political spectrum. It's so epidemic. A 2018 National Institute of Mental Health study said about 40 million adults between the ages of 18 to 54 struggle with anxiety disorders. 40 million in our country. Between 18 to 54. A 2017 Center of Disease Control report said the use of antidepressants, depression and anxiety are often linked, not always, but often. A 2017 CDC report said the use of antidepressants has increased 65% in the last 15 years. 40 million adults, 65% increase. We're talking about in 15 years. Strangely, at the same time the internet and social media has exploded. Correlation is not causation, but that's probably a factor. I talked about it last week, how what really social media has done for us is create a learned helplessness. As we're exposed to a far greater level of negative things than we can actually even affect or change. And it just becomes overwhelming. Now, my own story, of course, my parents divorced when I was 15-ish, and I was the youngest of three, so I lived with my dad, and I spent a lot of time alone. When I wasn't out with my friends, which was probably medication for me along with the drunkenness and other things that went on with that, I was typically alone. So I spent a lot of time alone, and I had a lot of time to wrestle through stuff, which quickly had me bottoming out in my own depression, and I got saved senior year in high school. When I look back on it now, I realized, I was probably depressed. I didn't define it that way back then. And I don't think I really came fully out of it, even though I got saved, for probably a year or two after that. Just the fog that slowly dissipated when you get in that place. But as that fog was dissipating, and I eventually, got into church and started majoring in religion and philosophy at what I thought was a Christian school, which it wasn't. But my first Bible study I ever taught as a high school senior was on spiritual warfare. First public speech I ever gave at Davis and Elkins College my freshman year, Elkins, West Virginia. When you had to take that public speaking class and get up there and speak, I spoke on worry and fear from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. So that's when I was 17, 18, 19. And I can look back on those things and be, I was probably wrestling with that more than I would even care to admit. As these opportunities came, this is what I spoke on. Here's the thing. So now I want to back up for just about 5 minutes, and then I want to land at the end on some main points from Peter about how to frame it. When fear, as we experience fear, and I want to just take a step back, and then, like I said, we'll go back to 1 Peter. Fear, as we experience it, is precognitive. Now, here's what I mean by that quite literally. You have experienced fear and sent a signal to your brain that you're afraid before you can analyze or think about fear. It's precognitive. Now, there's all kinds of reasons why that's the case. If you're really curious about the technical side of it, we can talk more about that at Faith Facts or something like that. I just want you to understand it is precognitive. And that doesn't mean our cognitive mind doesn't have a big part to play in it. It has a massively huge part to play in it as far as handling the fear. But really, James 1, which we're not going to be in today, is, of course, inspired exactly right. Count it all joy when you're stressed. Count it all joy when you're afraid. Count it all joy when you are challenged. The cognitive part kicks in when you say, after experiencing fear for a certain period of time, before you even really become cognitively aware, I'm afraid, I'm threatened, I'm stressed. At that point, when your brain catches up, you have a choice to make. And that choice is incredibly important. But if we don't do better at understanding all this stuff that's going on before you even get to that choice, it's going to be harder for you to make the right choice. The choice is, I can stay threatened or I can get challenged. I can have this spiral downward and just keep spiking on the fear loop, or I can choose a path that leads to empowerment and joy, because the joy of the Lord is your strength, and fear and anxiety are rooted in a learned helplessness. Okay? And no steward of God should ever be walking around in this perpetual state of learned helplessness. We must fight. And where the brain kicks in is when you tune out distractions, say, in this present moment, I am feeling stressed or afraid. And really what I'm doing is I'm creating all these scenarios based on my experience, and I have experience for a reason, but I really just need to focus on this. Or we start, a sign that your anxiety and fear is getting the better of you is when you're visualizing all the bad things that are going to happen to you, instead of focusing on, God, what are you positively telling me to do? That's when you know you're stuck in the fear loop, is when your cognitive brain starts kicking in with all these scenarios that are bad ending, bad ending, bad ending, bad ending, bad ending, bad ending, bad ending. And it just keeps the spike of fear going. And none of it has anything to do with, God, what are you asking me to do right now? Because what's the worst bad ending? I'll die. What's your ending? You're going to die. So all of this is training. But fear is hitting our body at levels that are pre-cognitive, pre-logical, pre-analytical, and then driving it. We often focus on the five senses when we feel afraid, and there's a reason for that. But we become very unaware of what's going on inside of us. So we have this perception, what's out there. And if you're feeling anxious or nervous enough, as people are, we have a fear epidemic, you will create a reason out there to explain what you're feeling. If there isn't literally someone coming at you with a knife or a bear on your path in the woods or something like that, you will create a reason. And that's driving a lot of our narratives today. But we're not aware of what's going on inside, or inner awareness. What one lady, Dr. Amanda Blake, describes as interoception. Instead of perception, interoception. Now, usually when you're spiked by fear, your immediate reaction is to say or do something to make the discomfort disappear. So it might be, you can't leave me. I'll go with you, even if you're terrified to go, but you're more terrified to stay. Or, I'm not going, you go. Which is really, I'm more terrified to go, I'll stay. But you're not saying that. You know, it's really what's just going on is some spike comes out. Now, we wear masks and we phrase it in certain ways, rather than saying, what's really driving me right now inside? It's essentially a knee-jerk reaction, an irresistible compulsion to act a certain way. Remember, precognitive. Now, when you experience fear and you're more aware of it emotionally, you'll tend to feel a flutter in your chest, a sinking feeling in your gut. There's reasons you're feeling this. Your heart actually has cells in it that are comparable to brain cells. There's a small group of cells in your amygdala, which is what controls your fear, that fires 6 to 8 milliseconds after each heartbeat. So you encounter something, your heart goes, and 6 to 8 milliseconds later, brain says, fear. Then you start analyzing it. Your gut, think about how the Bible talks about mind, heart, bowels of compassion. Fear in the gut. Your gut is your mini brain. It is home to roughly 100 million neurons. That's more than your spinal cord. That's more than your peripheral nervous system. Your gut is the only known part of your nervous system that can override messages from the brain. Let me tell you how this plays out for a lot of us. I'm hungry. You're not hungry. Oh, no, I'm hungry. Or, I can't eat. You're anorexic. Eat. No. Hunger and fullness are powerful states of being that go far beyond our mere need for food and drink. And we get them in the gut. It's also where a huge part of your immune system is. It's in your gut. Now, all that technical stuff, move on quickly. Just to say, because the way we tend to think of it is, oh, I'm afraid, let me analyze it, which is important. That's the cognitive part. But God took so many people in the Bible, so many people, and said, you're afraid, here, and put them into a situation that was incredibly threatening to them, that they could not think their way out of. So you just need to feel this. You need to experience this. Oh, you're an expert fisherman. I got a good one for you. And I'm going to do it twice. And the second time, I'm going to walk on the water and really freak you out. Think through that one. Oh, you guys think you're warriors. Have you met Goliath? Step in the ring with that guy. No thanks. And the body has all these things that go on. I'll tell a story about a guy named Brian Flippinger. Brian was diagnosed very early in his life with monochromatic colorblindness, meaning totally colorblind. He saw in grayscale, blacks and whites and grays. That's all he saw. That's once he actually got into medical care that he was diagnosed with this. Brian was raised in an extremely abusive home with a probably borderline psychotic mother who, whenever he acted out, he would get beaten and then literally locked in the closet in the basement of his house for like hours and hours and hours, again and again and again. Well, he grew up, got out of that home, met a woman, and I said his name because he shared his story. So, met a woman, and Brian really just became a fixer type. He would just make sure everybody else was happy. Gee, I wonder why, right? Not that he put all that together yet. His wife ended up having multiple affairs with his wife, and he would always stay and come back and just make it right. And he'd tell himself all the reasons why he was making it right. And a lot of them were good reasons. I want to be here for the daughter. I want to make this marriage work. But that wasn't what was driving him. It took him years to figure out what was driving him. And then one day he caught the next guy of many guys with his wife. And the guy tried to get in the car and he lost it. He had a fit of rage and he dragged the guy out of the car and just beat the tar out of the guy. Well, that was a wake-up call. And they divorced after that. And by then, his daughter's an adult. And he says, if I ever pursue a relationship with anyone else again, I want you to sue me to have me declared incompetent. So you can take over decisions from my estate. He was that determined to never get another relationship again. But then he was at something related to work. And he met this lady. She had her doctorate in psychology. And somehow they got caught in a rainstorm. And he's like, great, it's pouring. And she went out in the rain, and she just put her arms up, and she's just laughing. And she's just absorbing the rain and experiencing the moment. And she's this brilliant, analytical lady. But she has this, and something about her got past all of his defenses. Later, he went back and looked at it. He learned that he actually walked with a little bit of a forward hunch. It was always a little bit guarded. And he was always super aware to make sure everybody around him was okay. Didn't even really know why. But that was a turning point for him. Eventually, he went sheepishly back to his daughter and said, I'm okay, don't get me committed, but I found someone. And he eventually married her, and that was a big turning point for him. He went and saw her doing psychological coaching for people, trauma victims, and a lot of it was physical, related to the body. Kind of like God. Here, get in that boat in the storm. Here, go to that third world nation. Use that outhouse with the barely dug pit where you're gagging as you go into it. God, what are you doing? You know, all these different things that go on. And that was very healing for him. He eventually got into this group with this life coach type person. And that really worked for him. It was mostly men in the group, but there were a few women. And then he realized, I need to deal with this rage. And so he went to his life coach and said, I have a lot of anger. And he's like, yeah, you do. He already saw it. So I want you to coach me through that. He said, well, I will, but I will not do it alone because you're dangerous. You have a lot of anger. You pick somebody else that you want to be there. And he picked a lady that was in the class that his wife knew, and it was all good. And so he's like, all right. So I said, he worked with them for a while, and then he brought him out he said, you're going to go to this barn. Meet me at the barn at some crazy early morning hour. So he does. He goes out to the barn, and the girl's there, and the coach is there, and Brian is there. And he gets out there, and there's an Aikido martial art mat. And there's a Jo, which is a 5-foot instead of a 6-foot bow staff. And there's this padded pillow-like thing. And they have this whole curriculum of stuff for him to do physically throughout the whole day. But one of the early things is, okay, you got a lot of anger. That anger is tied to things you've experienced. So start hitting the pad. And as things come to your mind, confess them. Just verbalize what you're angry about, what you experienced, what you're reminded of. So he's like, really? Seriously? Fine, starts hitting it. Come on, hit it! He starts hitting it, and eventually, memories start to come back. And he starts verbalizing them. Confess your faults to one another that you may be healed. Make the good confession, like Jesus did before Pontius Pilate when he was threatened. Verbalize it. So he started doing it. He got angrier and angrier. And he's beating this thing half to death. He falls on his knees. His arms are trembling. He's still wailing on this thing. And then he finally collapses, and he's laying there. And the coach lets him lay there for a while, and he says, hey, we need to move on to the next thing. This is the beginning of this day. So he's crying and weeping through all this. And he says, okay. And he gets up, and he looks up, and he goes, I'm like, what's wrong? I see colors. That's an extreme example. But in his early life, his world was grayscale. It was a closet that he was locked in. And his whole body had acclimated to that. And that was how he saw the world. That was not how the world was. That was just how he saw it. And he was never going to see it the way God actually designed him to see it until he dealt with his fear and the corresponding anger. And neither are we. Our examples aren't going to be that extreme. But what we get into as we contemplate this story, we need to explore 3 kinds of askings. And that's all I'm going to have time for today. Wanted to get to 1 Peter, but I also really wanted to lay a foundation for this and hear from you. In the Bible, we read these passages, and he asked, and this question was asked, and that's fine. But there's really 3 levels of asking. And unfortunately for us, because the language the New Testament was written in is more complex, we typically use one word and it's 3 different words. But we can get these emotionally. The first level, and this is what Jesus says when he says, ask and you shall receive. The first level, and the idea behind this form of asking is, I have no right to expect any specific answer. If you give the answer, great. If you don't, I'm fine. I just want to ask. I have no claim. I'm just asking. That's the kind where Jesus says, if you ask like that, you'll receive. Now, in context, you'll receive the good gift, which is the Holy Spirit. There's another level. This isn't bad either. This is, I need more information. This is the one the disciples did to Jesus a lot. He would do something. They started asking questions. They weren't being demanding, but he was blowing up their world, and their analysis is kicking in. They're saying, why? What? What's this? That's not necessarily bad, but if you don't get the information you want, you're going to start to get nervous or frustrated and just start digging harder. In John chapter 16, Jesus talks a lot about this. And the third level, which is, hey, I asked you a question. I'm asking the questions here. Right now it's a control thing. And that level 1 and level 2 in John 16, as Jesus is in the last night with his disciples and they're peppering him with all these questions, he says, you guys are asking this level 2 questions. You want more information, more information, more information, more information. Boom, 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 boom. You're asking questions, asking questions, asking questions. When the Holy Spirit comes, you won't need all those answers. And you'll ask at level 1 and you'll receive. You won't need an answer. You'll be in a good place and you just ask. And that's going back and forth in John 16. So when the Holy Spirit comes, you won't be peppering me with all these questions, wanting answers. You'll ask and you'll receive. Level 3 is what Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians 14 when he says, you got these women in a group over here in the worship service and they're really fired up and they're demanding answers. Just ask at home. Don't ask. Don't be like that in church. That's what he's talking about. Level 3 is a lot of what the Pharisees did to Jesus. They came in, see, they're power and control oriented. We're asking the questions here. We're interrogating. He's like, yeah, but you don't care about answers. This is a power and control struggle. You just want to be the one asking the questions. When we are afraid, we go from level 2 and level 3. When we're in a good place, we just ask. And if I get an answer, great. And if I don't get an answer, I'm good. Because I'm in a good place. It doesn't mean we're not supposed to ask questions. We are. Ask and you shall receive. Seek and you shall find. Knock and the door will be open. But a lot of times you don't get answers and you're still okay. It's what Karl Barth said. He said, well, I don't need to know. I believe. And those 3 levels of asking are what stop us from mastering the principles of managing fear. And that's what Peter is really talking about. Many, many times in scriptures, as I've already said, God puts us in this place where our body is afraid, which means our psyche, our soul, and our spirit are afraid. When you are brought before kings, when Goliath is facing you, when you're in prison and beaten, when you're in a storm, when you're shipwrecked and drifting on the ocean, as happened to Paul, when you're beaten, imprisoned, crucified, when you're facing crazy demonic manifestations. And God does that to us again and again and again, usually in very small ways. And if we learn those lessons, maybe he trusts you with other ones. Sometimes he just, hey, how about a fiery furnace? How about a den of lions? How about that one? Think your way out of this. And such an approach is important, we need to think, but it's woefully inadequate. Get beyond the negative motivations. I wanted to land on this. The first example we should be looking to, and this is pointed for our church, the first example we should be looking to about managing fear is our elders. And that's me, Phil, Derek, Mark Bell, Joe Settles, Dave Morgan, Ken Turner, Dave Jones. Don't think I missed anybody. If they did, I'm probably glad. They're probably glad. Oh, good, left them out. That's where Peter starts. He tells the elder, he says to the elders, look, don't be an elder under compulsion. That's like you feel like it's necessary, or you'll be guilty, or you'll be punished, or you feel threatened, like you need to be in control. Don't do it for that reason. Negative motivations just feed fear in all of its many faces. God comes in and saves you and says, yeah, don't fear condemnation. No. No. Not negative motivations. Cultivate a noble, positive passion. He says, don't serve under compulsion because you feel like it's necessary, that you're going to feel guilty if you don't, or threatened if you don't, or punished if you don't, but willingly as God would have you, not for shameful gain. Don't do a prosperity gospel. Because all the elders here make so much money. Well, I do, but the rest of them don't. I mean, Phil and Derek get a little bit. So no, I don't think y'all worry about that one here. But eagerly, this eagerly is the same thing that Paul said about the Bereans. Why they had such a noble spirit, or Luke technically. They were eager. It's this positive desire. Remember what Paul, it's not the same word here, but what Paul says to Timothy, he who desires the office. It's a positive desire. Desire is a good thing. That's the starting point, is I've got to become aware of how much of what I do is done out of negative motivation. And how is that ever really going to diminish fear? Versus, this is just who God made me to be. I'm a steward. Fear is what's going to stop you from reaching positively for what God's calling you into. Or poison it if you do. Fear. Get beyond the negative motivations and cultivate a noble, positive passion. It can bring a world of beautiful color to your grayscale of fear. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this time. Help us to learn how to know and face our fears so we can see the world more as you created us to see it and not from a lens of fear. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.